Thank you. So I will see if my slides come up as well, yes. So I'm a professor of law at the Technical University, and my headline is about lawyers in the cyber world, whether we are good, bad, or useless, or maybe a bit of everything. Usually, when talking about lawyers in the cyber world or in any world, nobody likes us until things go wrong. And then everybody comes running. And actually, this is very much the same also in the cyber world. I'm starting in the outer space. Space is actually my main love in the legal area. That's what I did my thesis on once long time ago, the law of outer space. I'm chairing one of the committees for the European Space Agency. I could talk about space law for hours. I'm not going to. That's not the topic for today. It's quite common nowadays, it's quite popular to compare cyberspace and outer space, the regulation and the legal systems and so. I'm also not going to do that, but I'll just give you one thought that I have noticed when studying, especially when I did my thesis, the old sources on outer space law, which are from, say, the 1950s, 1960s, and looking at old sources on the cyber world, which would be from the 1990s, then last century. Then what we see is a lot of this very romantic notion about now we're starting something entirely new. We will forget the borders on Earth and we will think in new ways of cooperation, and we're going to ignore the laws and the regulation. We're instead going to work in entirely new ways. And this doesn't work out like that. It didn't work out like that in the cyber world, in the outer space world, to start with that, that's older. It didn't work out like that in the cyber world. But what happens is that it becomes an issue of how is it possible to actually apply laws and rules in this new environment. And that's a bit what I meant by saying nobody likes the lawyers until then things start going wrong. Then suddenly the lawyers are needed, and that's a bit what cyber security, especially perhaps if we look at this from the cyber crime side, is very much showing. It's now a question of this new world being mature enough that there are lots of questions. So how can we actually act against the bad things that are happening? So maybe it's not too imaginative or too difficult to agree that we need rules. We cannot have a totally unregulated area. But there tends to be perhaps more and more voices saying that this don't necessarily have to come from lawyers, that there is very much that artificial intelligence, robots, can do instead. So yes, we need to work within certain frameworks of rules and regulations, but those are best and most securely actually automated. Yes, to some extent. I think there are quite a few basic decisions that can be made, probably better and more securely by machines, by artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence keeps getting smarter, so it may be able to do even more things. But I don't know if there are any other lawyers in the room, but if there are, it may be a good message that we are not going to be useless for a while yet. And I'll give you just a very basic example of why not. As you probably all know, when you're teaching a computer to actually take decisions rather than, say, go beyond the very simple computers or the older versions where they did exactly what you told them, you can now teach them to do more things. Let's say that you teach the computer to distinguish between a cow and a horse. What you do then, simply put, is that you show lots of pictures of cows and horses. So eventually the computer will learn to distinguish based on the knowledge it has assembled. It will make some mistakes because some cows may look more like horses and the other way around. But eventually it will learn it, and it is possible objectively to say what is a cow and a horse, because we have criteria for that. And I'll give you a very current example of what Facebook is at the moment doing. Facebook has come under a lot of criticism for the political interference that Facebook users have been causing. So there's been a lot of emphasis on Facebook to do something about it. And they have just, like in the last few days, weeks, started closing a number of Facebook sites. This then gets them with political content. This then brings on the accusation that they are censoring free expression. But what they say is that no, they are not closing the sites because of the content. They are closing it because of the activities of the groups that are behind those sites. Try teaching that distinction to artificial intelligence. Even for humans, it is very difficult. We're looking at a Facebook site and they're saying, no, it's not what's on there that makes us wary of this site. It is because the group that set this site up has done or said things that we are afraid of. So these kind of distinctions, so far, can really only be made by humans, because they do not have any clear objective criteria. It's not like between the horse and the cow that we just have to find enough facts and we can tell the difference. This is something which is different at one moment from another. It's different in one context than another. It needs somebody, and that humans are the only ones so far who can do that, who can really weigh things against one another. And I'm not even mentioning, although it's on the screen here with this ethics question, what is actually ethics? There's no answer to really what is ethics. Ethics is one of these things that one should know when you see it, or maybe rather see the absence of it, but it's not possible to say what it is. It just means certain things sometimes should not be done because they are bad, and in other cases one should do something, and this is different than law. And this is also something which, for the moment at least, it would be very difficult to teach artificial intelligence to do that, simply because humans couldn't make the kind of cards with the horses and cows about what is ethics. It is specific to the time, it's specific to the place, to the culture, etc. Still, it is not individual. That's the whole point of ethics. Ethics is not my opinion. Ethics is something more. Because something I can find that something is ethical, it may still be unethical in society, and the other way around. So these kind of things are reasons why also in the cyber world we need this kind of thinking of really what's the good or bad and what's possible and what's not. But it doesn't have to be complicated. Some people think that lawyers are, the more laws and the more complicated they are, the happier we are. So it would seem like when we do something as technically complex as, say, e-governance, for instance, that we would want to have laws that are as complicated as the technologies. But I think this is definitely not what we should advocate for. Actually, very often we don't need any new laws at all because of this new environment. Because we just need to think, what is it that is different, that from a regulatory perspective is different? If I tell you that extremely important thing is the legal validity of digital transactions, this sounds really boring. And if you are not lawyers, and even if you are lawyers, you would really think this sounds like an incredibly boring thing. If I ask you, do you want to know when you pay for an air ticket on the internet whether you can actually fly? You would probably say yes. Do you want to know when you've paid money to buy some goods, and if it never arrives, that you can do something about it? Do you want to know if you've applied for planning permission via e-services, you can actually build a house and not get fined for building it? Yes, you would of course say yes. This is the legal validity of digital transactions. That's what it means. It means that you have to ensure that when you do things in a certain manner, the law recognizes it. So if the law says that you have to sign with a blue pen, we have a problem, because what is a blue pen in the digital world? We need to change the law in that case. Actually, what we need to change the law for in any case is digital identity, because that is simply too different than identity in the offline world, where we have for thousands of years developed a system by which we know what we do. We show ourselves, maybe we have to show an ID, we have to sign or something, perhaps we need witnesses. So how do we do this when we don't have the physical contact? That we need to regulate. But let's take cybercrime then, so we're talking about related issues. Fraud. Is fraud a cybercrime? Nod or shake your heads? Very good gesture. Exactly, like this, like that. Fraud has probably existed as long as humans have existed. I'm sure the first humans tried to trick one another into getting the best stone to make a bigger axe or something like that. There's nothing new about fraud. Totally off the top of my head, I haven't seen any statistics. I would imagine 99.9% of fraud this day is in the internet, because that is simply the way fraud is exercised nowadays. And of course it's different, because you can defraud persons at the other end of the world. You never need to meet them, and you can potentially defraud much more successfully, because you can try out 1 million people at one go, and if only one of them or two of them believes you, you may have already achieved something. But it's not a cybercrime. It's a crime that existed for a long time. It's just a crime that is handled in a different manner. It's tempting to make new laws. It's tempting not actually maybe mainly for lawyers, so let's say for the very traditional lawyers who tend to work more of implementing legislation rather than creating it. Maybe it seems tempting to have new laws because it's kind of easy to show it. But I would say it's actually perhaps more tempting for politicians or for sort of opinion leaders, because it's very easy to say, look, we've passed a new law, we passed 10 new laws, or we passed all of these different things. When actually maybe the problem is, how do we implement the rules that already exist? For instance, about criminal legislation, when national borders are so unimportant, when people can actually move so easily. That's the problem, not the fact that it doesn't say exactly everything in the law. Yes, there are certain things. Hacking, for instance, I would say hacking is probably best regulated with specific provisions. But you don't need the cybercrime law. You can put specific provisions in your existing criminal code, and then you have the benefit of all the rest of that code still applying. General questions of whether also attempted crimes are criminalized and all those things. But you need to explain it, because hacking is not easily compared to existing crimes, because it's not really theft, because there may not be any value as such. It's not really destruction of property, because maybe you didn't actually destroy it, it looks intact, so we just need to write it down somehow. But for other things, we don't need to explain everything. And for very many legal issues, I'm not saying there's no legal work. Actually, lawyers should be much more involved in the digital society than they are nowadays. But the work is more like looking, so what is it actually that is special because of the different way of doing something? And that isn't solved by just writing a new law. At the same time, one should sort of reflect on whether not regulating or not having rules is the best way forward. This is lawyers love questions that don't have a clear answer. So this is also a question that you could answer yes or no. Regulation is sometimes very good for business. Sometimes deregulation appears to be better. I'll permit myself one more space-related little example. I did my thesis nearly 20 years ago, and I wrote about the difference between permitted use of outer space and banned appropriation. Because there are treaties in outer space, so you cannot appropriate it, but you can use it, and there's no clear distinction. This issue is very topical now, because Luxembourg passed the law on space appropriation last year, and the United States did it the year previous. There are now 2 laws about actually taking resources from outer space. Don't worry, I'm not talking more about space now. But this doesn't mean that I was some huge visionary 20 years ago and I knew that this would be an issue, because what they're discussing now is exactly my thesis. Unfortunately, I'd love to say I was really like, I thought of this before anybody else. No, people have been talking about this for 20 years or more, and not very much has happened. Because space is an area that hasn't had very clear regulation, apart from very general principles. It's expensive to invest in space. So companies are nervous because you don't want to put lots of money somewhere where you are not sure whether this is actually permitted, whether if something for some reason, as I said, goes wrong, do you have any recourse? Can you turn somewhere, or will it have been found that you've actually done something against the law? Countries have started passing national space laws very recently, with some exceptions. So until recently, companies, because companies don't want to start interpreting the treaties like the way you do when you write a thesis, companies want to look at something and see, can I do this, under which circumstances and how? When they haven't been able to do that, it's meant that the investments didn't really take off, because it was an unregulated area. With more regulation, which is now happening, companies are suddenly more interested in investing. So for the space, we can see how when regulation increases, investments increase, innovation increase. You feel more secure. The cyberspace area has shown a little bit of an opposite trend, in that lots of innovative things happened without it being very clear about rules. And so that's like more recent, that there's more emphasis again on having rules, making laws. One explanation is simply because it's not so expensive to come up with some fancy app. You can do it on your laptop at home. You don't need all the infrastructure you need to do actually something in space. So it may be easier to do this and just kind of risk it. Maybe also because there are different types of people involved. Smaller enterprises, more of this sort of, because space, even if somebody may have a wild idea, but it's just so expensive to do something, so a small SME isn't really likely to be able to have any plans. I mean, yes, for space applications, but not for actually the big things. Maybe that's an explanation. Maybe time has changed. So here we could see actually a little bit contrary sort of trends, perhaps. But I think still, even for the sort of cyber area, the more this becomes something, a part of our everyday life. And it was very interesting to listen to your presentation about the Internet of Things, how many risks there are, as you rightly pointed out with this. And there will be more and more things thought up that could intelligent devices and so on. The more the risks are, I think then will come again this phase where, when the regulation is unclear who actually is responsible for different things, it may hold back development. So it is not, and it's popular in the sort of freedom of expression context to mention that security and freedom are actually not opposites. And I would say regulation and deregulation are also actually not opposites, because clever regulation can actually be more opening and free than just deregulating. What is very relevant to keep in mind when looking at laws and rules about things, and I've already mentioned similar things, but I'd like to now just focus a little bit on data specifically. Are we talking about the form or the content? This is what I mentioned with generally with laws. We don't need to make new laws about everything. And with data protection is not internet issue. It looks like it is. The first legislation on data protection came in the late 1970s, and from then on it's come in more and more countries. So at about the same time as automated data handling started, automated data processing started happening. So there's only one international global treaty, or it's not global, European international treaty that mentions data protection by name, and that's the European Union's Charter of Fundamental Rights. Other treaties talk of protection of privacy, and that is more than just data. That actually was not written with data in mind. That was written with the things in mind that you cannot go into people's houses or search their bags without having good reason or so. So it looks like this is a cyber issue or an electronic data issue. But it shouldn't be, at least not fully, because what is relevant is, what is that data? Is the content of it something that is sensitive? A simple example, and it's oversimple, so I'll explain it a bit better in a second, but it's just phone books. I mean, those of us who are old enough to remember when everybody had, you just looked up phone number, address, name. It was available, it's public information. You actually, in some countries, had to pay if you wanted your number to be secret, because normally everybody who had a phone, you just looked up it. You can go and find out where somebody lives and walk past their house and look in the window and so on. That was nothing strange. Now some people almost sort of freak out when they realize that their name and address is on internet. You know, how did it get there? You know, so we have to remember that data, all data is not sensitive. Why, as I said, this is an overly simplistic example, is that of course what is new with automated data handling, with computers basically, is that you can do things that before would have been so complicated or time consuming. I mean, you can use so much data, and from that you can actually distill knowledge in a way that you can't in a sort of traditional world. So yes, it may be more sensitive because there may be more things sort of coming out from it. What I mean with these images is that, of course, a temptation for governments is that you fish with a net when you want to find something out, rather than fishing with the fishing rod. You basically catch everything. You survey loads of people. You gather lots and lots of information about pretty much everybody, because in there might be a bad fish, instead of first figuring out where this bad fish is and then going after it with the fishing rod and actually catching especially that fish. This is a very dangerous tendency, and this is something where the rights perspective, the human rights side of law is very important, that to remind governments of this, that no, you can't do this. It's not particularly efficient, because you get so much in that net that you may waste so much time on actually trying to find what is relevant, that if you had been more targeted to start with, you probably would have saved yourself time. But it's also not correct from a human rights viewpoint. We are not all guilty until proven innocent, but it's the other way around. And my very final point, a couple of minutes left, or 5 even, okay, so I have some time maybe for some questions. My message, perhaps to sum it up, to sort of what I want you to perhaps take away from this little session, is then that we need a legal framework, but we don't actually need a specific designated, newly written legal framework that is incredibly complicated. We don't match the complication of the technology with the complication in the law, actually more or less the other way around. The law should be very simple and clear, because it should focus on what it is that needs regulation. We don't regulate for regulation's sake, we regulate because there are certain risks that we want to look at. And those risks are the same really as in the offline world, but in a completely different context. So one needs to be sort of open to that context. But there is one thing that more than maybe the context and the issues that is very different, and that's who are the actors, the privatization of our lives. I mentioned already this Facebook example with how they are determining now which sites are politically undesirable. The image here, it's from Ireland, and why I've picked Ireland as an example here is that you may have heard there was a referendum on abortion in May in Ireland, May this year. Google decided not to allow any political sites, any campaigning, anything related to this referendum on Google, because they were afraid of being hijacked by a certain side in this referendum. Good or bad decision? We don't need to discuss that here, but it's a private company. Private company decides this is something that it's dangerous for them, so they don't have this information. You could say, well, it's just one private company, so who cares? It's like, you know, a certain airline not flying to a certain destination. There are others who do it. But Google is more important than any private company has been in the history of the world. Facebook as well. I mean, there are other companies like that that are simply so important that what they do is what determines a lot of the debate and protection of rights and so on. And this is a new thing. And this is something which for lawyers, but also for society as a whole, we still have to struggle to deal with. It's not entirely new. We've had for a long time, for instance, critical infrastructure protection, where private firms have special roles because they are so important for our daily lives. So there are ways of doing this through licenses by regulatory authorities and so it's not like we're starting from scratch. But it's never been to that extent. There's always sort of been the final solution, if things don't work out, that there will be others who will come in. And now if these big companies would disappear, a lot of the sort of world as we know it would disappear. So that is not technology as such, but it is brought about by technology is definitely something that we also need to think about, the change in who is actually creating rules. So I'll finish with that. I think I stuck exactly to my time.
Yes, thank you. Maybe somebody have a questions? Okay.
Hello, I'm a lawyer. I have a question about cybercrime and Convention of Council of Europe about cybercrimes. So basically, it's a very convenient document that states that states should introduce the following acts and present them as crimes under their national laws. I saw the example of Latvia, how Latvia has done that. So it's not like a direct copy-paste of the convention, which usually takes place, but this is a very selective introduction of specific and combining of specific provisions of the convention with the law, which sometimes create kind of a mess because, for instance, fraud still was left as a fraud, which is applicable for many different also offline fraud cases. So how do you think would such convention, within the context of what you have said, that you can classify crimes very differently, would such convention, such structure of convention work? And maybe you also have some information on whether it has worked and are there any effective results of its application?
No, thank you. That's a very good question to illustrate really what I was trying to show. I think the convention is good for the reasons you yourself mentioned in the beginning, that it actually is not a convention that you take as it is and just have it. So because then it would be difficult because of the different structure of criminal law in different countries and so. So it is a convention that says these are the things you need to focus on and you can do it differently. So I think that is a good thing. I think that is the way it should be, because in some country it would mean a new law, in some it means amendment to its laws and so. The negative side of that, I still think the positive sides dominate, is that it will be it can be quite messy in that sense, but this is something really for the national law to sort out, and I think the benefits of it outweigh it. I think it has been a reasonably successful convention. It's got quite a lot of parties. It's also open for parties outside of Europe, and it's beginning to be adopted by different countries in Africa and Asia, so it hopefully will set a kind of global standard, and I think it will give a framework. So it's not perfect at all, but maybe it's the best that can be done, because it will give a framework in which countries can then sort of share their experiences, or you can see how somebody else implemented it, and maybe if, let's say, in Latvia, this question of the fraud is a bit unclear, they can see that, look, here it was done in, I don't know, Hungary in one way or something. So it is, in that sense, it's very much of a framework. It's very different than, for instance, EU law, because it's like it leaves much more scope to the countries themselves. So yes, the messiness is there, you're absolutely right, it could be there, but I think it's still a good way of trying to get everybody to think of the same things and sort of work towards a solution.